4,500 years ago in Africa, a civilization unparalleled in antiquity emerged, the most enduring civilization and one of the most powerful and iconic in history, the Egyptian. In this episode of our Origin series, we explore the full history and astounding achievements of perhaps the greatest of all civilizations of the ancient world. The longest-lived culture in human history, it thrived and grew into an extraordinarily successful society. Join us as we explore 3,000 years of ancient Egyptian history on a journey of discovery, which will take us through every stage of this magnificent civilization, which still remains a mystery thousands of years later.
Welcome to our channel. Discover the captivating episodes of our Origin series, for which I leave a link above, guiding you through the history of mankind in chronological order. Don't miss this incredible journey. Subscribe, like, and share to help us reach even more curious minds. Thank you.
Where did the civilization of ancient Egypt come from? How did it all begin for this civilization, which lasted more than 3,000 years and would become one of the most powerful and iconic civilizations in history? An empire that came, at its peak, to extend from the north in what is now Syria to the south where Sudan is located today. Not only are the origins of Egypt still shrouded in mystery today, but even the Egyptians themselves had no precise idea of its antiquity or origin. The history of this fabulous civilization can be divided into three great periods of prosperity in which the Egyptian people were ruled by a succession of 300 pharaohs grouped into 30 royal dynasties. The first great period in the history of Egypt is that of the Old Kingdom, in which the apogee of pharaonic Egypt is reached. It is the period in which the imposing pyramids were built and the moment in which a spectacular growth was evidenced. It was followed by an intermediate period of instability to give way then to the rise of the Middle Kingdom. A second intermediate period of instability was followed by the rise of the New Kingdom of Egypt. But there were people in Egypt long before the pharaohs, those who gave birth to the Egyptian civilization. Who were these first inhabitants? How does the story begin for what was one of the most advanced civilizations in the world for almost 3,000 years and one of the most fascinating of antiquity? Year 3000 before our era. Nearly 1 million people live on the Nile, fishermen, farmers, and hunters. But still no pharaoh rules this country, still divided, with city-states grouped into two great kingdoms, Lower and Upper Egypt. Egypt's history is about to change rapidly. A unified Egypt would lay the foundations for the progress of civilization. King Narmer, who ruled the south of the country, sends a message to Lower Egypt. The response to that message could mean a change in the destiny of the entire nation, uniting them or plunging them into war. Narmer had demanded that the northern tribes submit to his authority. He wanted to unite these tribes to the powerful southern kingdom. These delta principalities in the north had always remained outside his domain. But the northern tribal chiefs refused his request. Then, King Narmer, after having consolidated his power in the south, and having gathered several hundred men to extend his dominions, prepares them for war. Faced with the refusal of the northern tribes to submit to his authority, the time for attack has come. Narmer, armed with the rudimentary stone maces and spears of his time, went to war. He defeated his enemies and united Egypt into a single kingdom. Victory that allowed him to create a great empire. This is what has been believed for more than a century, based on what was deduced from the palette of Narmer, a stone inscription, 5,000 years old, found in 1898 in Hierakonpolis, the capital of Upper Egypt, and which was thereafter the most important source of information to understand how the unification of Egypt occurred. But was it really a bloody war that turned the country into a single empire? Could all this have happened in peace? The answer to this question is crucial to understanding the 3,000 years that followed in Egypt's history. But in the lands of the Nile Delta, there is no answer. There are no clues as to how this period of history unfolded. Many Egyptologists believe that this unification was a peaceful operation, the result of a long and gradual period of assimilation over a span of several generations in which a unified culture emerged. In the southern desert in Abydos, many clues are hidden as to what really happened and how Egypt was actually founded. A settlement was found there, more than 5,000 years old, believed to be a sacred center. In it, the tombs of the first pharaohs were discovered. There was a center of political power, from the Zero dynasty, and broken pieces of pottery, the size of a fingernail, were found with some of the oldest writings in the world, dating from the 4th millennium BC. The tomb of the mysterious King Narmer was also discovered there, a simple trench with fragile brick walls and far too modest to house the man who would have been the founder of the Egyptian Empire. This is what does not close this story. All the kings in Egyptian history portrayed themselves as victors, even if they had never fought in a war. Narmer, perhaps, was no different, and this is what we see captured in the ancient palette. Other evidence of the peaceful unification of Egypt can be found 250 kilometers south of Abydos. In Hierakonpolis, the capital of Upper Egypt, was one of the largest settlements in the world at the time, with about 10,000 inhabitants, with a huge temple that dominated the center of the city. Also, on the outskirts of the city, there was a cemetery for the Egyptian elite with about 200 tombs. Hierakonpolis was an orderly and surprisingly civilized city. It stretched 5 kilometers along the Nile at a time when most Europeans were still living in isolated settlements. The residents of Hierakonpolis enjoyed a prosperous society based on trade and cooperation. Because of this, it is believed that the Battle of Narmer never took place, and that the Egyptians from the north and south of the country united peacefully. Yet, this is not conclusive evidence that this actually happened. To further explore the origins of Egypt, we move further back in time. At Kurta, about 100 kilometers south of Luxor, real signs of ancient life have been found high on the cliffs, 17,000 years older than the pyramids. These early people were nomadic, seasonally mobile herders. Back then, this area was a grassland, a green and fertile region. 10,000 years ago, gravity tilted the entire Earth off its axis by about half a degree, and this had a profound effect on the climate. Egypt would never be the same again. The climate change brought a decrease in rainfall, so animals and people were forced to move to areas of large lakes. One such area was Nabta Playa, 100 kilometers southwest of Aswan. Here, these nomadic hunters began to settle in communities. 9,000 years ago, 500 kilometers from Hierakonpolis, in the Sahara Desert, an early human occupation existed there. A cave with some of the largest prehistoric paintings was found at the site. The images on the cave walls show old men dancing, children playing, and animals not associated with the desert, such as antelopes, ostriches, and even giraffes. There, deposits of an ancient lake reveal why this desert area may have been inhabited long ago. The landscape was very different from today, and there was a savanna. Gigantic herds roamed the fertile plains of North Africa. For 4,000 years, human hunters and gatherers had plenty of food to eat. The members of this tribe could have been the ancestors of the pharaohs. At Nabta Playa, surrounded by pasture land to feed their livestock, the people could protect themselves from the heat and climatic variations of the desert. But rain was unpredictable, and without it, the lake dried up. A small stone circle was discovered there, a miniature Stonehenge, but 2,000 years older, dating back to 5000 BC. This pile of stones is actually one of the oldest calendars we know of, and served to predict the arrival of the rainy season. Around the year 5000 BCE, the summer monsoon changed its route again, now heading south. The rain finally stopped, and oases like Nabta Beach dried up forever. People who could no longer survive in an increasingly desert landscape were forced to migrate to the Nile as their only source of water. So ancient Egypt took shape as these people coalesced along the banks of the river. In the northern settlements, they clustered around the delta, and some cultures were created such as the Merimde, the Omari, or that of Al-Fayum. In the south, they were located around the Cana Bend. Egypt has been blessed with some of the most fertile land in the world, where farmers could grow everything. And it is the Nile that turned this desert land into a paradise. This was the beginning of the two lands of Egypt, Upper and Lower Egypt, which developed with two distinct cultures. These groups formed the first Egyptian state cities, and here arose the first kings, the first hieroglyphs, sailing, and the first irrigation works. Agriculture and animal husbandry became the basis for the livelihood of these peoples. The Egyptian calendar emerged at the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC and is the first known solar calendar in history. It arose with the aim of reducing the uncertainty generated by an unpredictable Nile. A flood of the Nile could wipe out villages, but if it remained too low, it caused famine. The world's first calendar was based on 3 seasons of 4 months each. It is the model for the calendar we use today. 2 types of calendars were used in Egypt, lunar and solar. The Egyptians may have used a lunar calendar earlier, but when they discovered the discrepancy between the lunar calendar and the regular passage of the seasons, they probably switched to a seasonal calendar, basing its regular start on each annual flooding of the Nile. The Egyptian year was divided into 3 agricultural seasons. The flood season, late summer and autumn, was called the inundation. In winter and early spring, when the water receded, the emerging land was cultivated, and that season was the sowing season. During the dry season, in late spring and early summer, when the Nile was at its lowest level, Harvesting took place in the harvesting season. All this was calculated by looking at the stars, especially one called Sirius, or Sopdet, related to the goddess Isis. The year began with the heliacal rising of Sirius, the summer solstice on the 20th of June, and this marked the beginning of the rising of the Nile. The Egyptians had developed a sophisticated writing system, not only earlier than previously thought, but even before the Sumerians in Mesopotamia, who were considered the first to produce a written language. The earliest Sumerian writing was an accounting system consisting of simple pictures and numbers. In contrast, Egyptian writing already contained signs that corresponded to sounds, like modern alphabets. It is estimated that the hieroglyphic writing of these peoples began around 3500 BCE, a little before the Sumerians. We would have no knowledge of the history of Egypt had it not been for the discovery of the Rosetta Stone by a French soldier in 1799. This stone shows the same text written in hieroglyphic, Demotic, and ancient Greek. Then, thanks to the work of Jean-François Champollion, it was possible in 1822 to extract the meaning of these symbols through the key of Greek, and with this to know the fantastic history of Egypt. The Nile not only provided water essential for life, but every year about a millimeter of fresh silt was deposited on the lands of Egypt, making its agricultural soil the richest on the entire planet. Silt was also used as a building material. Papyrus flourished in its marshes, providing the raw material used to make the first paper for the scribes' chronicles. The Egyptian people have to manage the great gift of the Nile through a network of dams, reservoirs, and irrigation canals. The Egyptians learned to manage their agriculture in a simple but enormously efficient way. Wheat grows faster there than anywhere else in the world. Grain became the currency of the country and Egypt's most important export item. The Egyptians soon realized that cooperation among themselves would be the key to their success. This cooperation also led to the specialization of society. The Nile was also the country's main transit route. Boats were indispensable for transporting both food and people. Peasants and fishermen used small papyrus boats perfectly suited for crossing from one bank of the Nile to the other. For longer journeys, they sailed in more sturdy boats made of wooden planks. These could carry heavy loads over long distances. These vessels formed the backbone of the Egyptian trade and transportation system that began during the Zero Dynasty. But let's get back to where we started with one of Egypt's still unsolved enigmas that has confronted researchers for decades. The unification of Egypt. What was the unification like? Was it a peaceful unification, or was it the product of a bloody war? As most archaeological finds testify, 5,000 years ago, a thriving agricultural and commercial society flourished peacefully along the banks of the Nile. But no one would have said so when contemplating the Narmer Palette. The stone is a monument to war. How can the two versions be reconciled, and can researchers resolve these contradictions? According to some archaeologists who have studied the Narmer Palette in depth, the weight of evidence suggests that the battle actually took place. There are too many details that refer to apparently concrete places, and there are too many such indications to assume that it is merely a symbolic representation. Other archaeologists working in southern Egypt found further evidence of rock paintings that tell the story of a king whose power reached all corners of the kingdom. These paintings had an iconographic similarity to the Narmer Palette. Many other similar depictions have also been found throughout the region. All this makes it seem likely that King Narmer unified Egypt by force when the north refused to submit to the power of the south. Controlling the north had become essential for the rulers of the south because as their population and prosperity increased, so did the demand for luxury goods, and these could only come from the Near East. Trade routes to the east passed through the Nile Delta and were under threat. For all these reasons, it is believed that the main factor for the expansion of the southern rulers to the north was to secure the trade routes. For all that has been discovered, the Narmer Palette would represent real historical events. The outcome of this war would unify and transform Egypt forever. King Narmer had completed what his predecessors had begun, the unification of the empire. And to symbolize this unity, the two crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt were merged into one from that moment on. For a period of at least 3,000 years, every pharaoh will wear it. Something really new has just begun, and the period of Narmer's rule was a turning point in the history of Egypt. It marks the transition between the pre-dynastic and dynastic periods. King Narmer reigned 62 years, during which he expanded Egypt's frontiers and acquired remarkable fame. Narmer's victory constitutes the starting point of a period of 3,000 years, with 31 dynasties of pharaohs with the rank of gods. Great names will follow, names that are still remembered today, such as Thutmose, Amenephis, Akhenaten, Ramses, Hatshepsut, and many others. Egypt had thus become the first territorial state in history, the first empire. When King Narmer died after a fruitful reign, the whole country mourned his loss. The end of Narmer's reign marks the beginning of a new era. From here, The energy that had previously been channeled into the conquest of Egypt was no longer needed. It could now flow into the architecture of the empire. The kings, now pharaohs, were no longer obsessed with war, but with the eternal life that awaited them in the afterlife. So they concentrated their architectural ambitions on the construction of tombs, culminating in the pyramids, an expression of the glory and power of the united Egyptian state. Civilization flourished and spread, united by the power of godlike kings. The era of the pharaohs had begun. Egypt had become the world's first nation-state. We will explore now the rise and fall of the ancient kingdom of Egypt. It is the period from the year 2600 to 2130 before our era. It is the first great period in which the apogee of pharaonic Egypt is reached, in which the imposing pyramids are built, and the time when spiritual growth was evident. A nation ruled by a succession of 300 pharaohs grouped in 30 royal dynasties. In this same period of time, the Sumerian civilization reached its greatest development. The Indus Valley civilization was expanding, and in America the Corral culture, the cradle of the Andean civilization, continued its expansion. Egypt went from daily survival to the development of science, mathematics, engineering, and astronomy. They studied the heavens and the seasons. They gave us the 24-hour day and the 365-day calendar. The ancient kingdom of Egypt begins with the rise to power of the Third Dynasty, around the year 2600 before our era. It encompassed 4 dynasties that ruled Egypt for 500 years. But first, let us travel further back in time, to the period immediately following the unification of Egypt. We will now briefly explore some events that occurred during the reign of Narmer, in the First Dynasty of Egypt. During that time, Narmer founded Memphis, the new capital located at the meeting point of Upper and Lower Egypt. Memphis was destined to be the largest city in the country. The pharaohs of Egypt's ancient empire would rule from Memphis for more than 3,000 years. The city had a port on the banks of the Nile River, where factories and workshops were built to make pottery vessels and clothing that were transported to neighboring cities in boats on the river. The kingdom was divided into provinces called nomes, governed by nomarchs. In this period of their history, the Egyptians already had conflicts with neighboring peoples. These were tribes from Libya and Nubia who did not accept the dominant power of the Egyptians. These tribes constantly rebelled and attacked most of the fertile towns and cities of Egypt. It is believed that the pharaoh Narmer, with political objectives, married Neith-Hotep, a princess from North Africa, to appease the disputes in the territory. Neith-Hotep would thus become the first queen of Egypt, perhaps the first female pharaoh after the death of Narmer. During the great history of ancient Egypt, the pharaohs played a more important role than the traditional figure attributed to kings and emperors. The Egyptians conferred absolute power on their king. They believed that the pharaohs had inherited divine blood, that they were descendants of Horus. Only a divinity could speak to the gods and protect them from natural disasters or invasions by foreign enemies. Only men and women who belonged to that lineage had the right to the throne. The pharaohs ruled the nation, were the supreme commanders of the army, the highest magistrates and the highest priests. The period and power of the pharaohs was not long. But finally there was a last battle against chaos from which the pharaoh could not escape. He was a man, and he had to die. Slowly, a new kind of monument arose that was to symbolize the final triumph of the king, that of eternal life. The era of the pyramids began. Built with rocks weighing up to 15 tons or gigantic statues carved out of individual blocks of granite that moved hundreds of kilometers. We don't know how they did it, but we know why. They made them to honor the pharaohs, both in life and after death. But before we dive into the mysteries of these architectural wonders of ancient Egypt, let's go back to where we started. We move to the year 2575 BCE, the time of the rise of the ancient kingdom. While, as we explained earlier, the pharaohs ruled the nation and were the supreme commanders of the army, the highest magistrates and the highest priests. They were accompanied by powerful officials called viziers. The Grand Vizier was like a prime minister, the highest-ranking official in the administration. The other viziers ran the treasury, were heads of a supreme court of justice and of all the king's services, such as the House of Arms or the Royal House. The clergy consisted of the high priests of the temples. The chancellors were in charge of directing battles or expeditions abroad, and for this purpose they had fleets and armed troops at their disposal. The scribes accounted for each of the transactions that were made in the cities and recorded all the production, which allowed a more precise allocation of resources. Scribes were also teachers in the schools. Government officials collected taxes and recruited peasants to work on crops or in construction. All these officials had the right to be buried next to the pharaoh in smaller pyramids or mastabas. The Old Kingdom period began around 2600 BCE, with the rise to power of the Third Dynasty. This period would last 500 years, until about the year 2100 before our era, and would include 4 royal dynasties. At this stage of history, the nation was still far from what would later become the ancient Egyptian power. Egypt was already established as an empire. It had fluid trade relations with the Mesopotamian and Canaanite peoples. It had become a land of great wealth. The Third Dynasty was founded by Pharaoh Nebka, who succeeded the last king of the Second Dynasty, King Khasekhemwy. The first part of the Third Dynasty was much more peaceful. Especially after the turbulent years prior to its founding, the people were still recovering from civil unrest and were hopeful that the new pharaoh would bring them much-needed respite. The Third Dynasty focused heavily on cultural activities. The most famous of the group of pharaohs of the Third Dynasty was Zoser, and it was he who ordered the construction of the step pyramid of Saqqara, the necropolis of Memphis, and the first built in what would later become known as the Land of the Pyramids. The reign of Zoser would mark the fundamental beginning of a period also known as the Pyramid Age, a time of great technological advancement in architecture. During this time, independent states were also established throughout Egypt, with power centralized in Memphis. These cities prospered and exhibited sophistication in the architectural field. Zoser succeeds in ruling in a period of wealth and peace. The Libyans were no longer a threat to peace, as they had defeated them in the early years of his reign. On the other hand, any threat to this new prosperity was instantly crushed by his legendary armies. Thanks to this period of peace, Zoser was able to put the focus on what he had always wanted to achieve: Egypt's architectural progress. Part of Zoser's success can be attributed to his most loyal vizier, Imhotep. Imhotep was the architect of the first pyramid. It is almost impossible to separate Imhotep's name from the successes of the Third Dynasty, especially when it comes to architecture. Imhotep was an Egyptian priest, poet, astronomer, architect, physician, and vizier to the king. Although he was a plebeian by birth, Imhotep eventually earned a position as a respectable member of society through sheer talent and tenacity. He was a deeply religious man and was a high priest. His knowledge of the gods enabled him to become Zoser's advisor. Zoser's reign lasted 29 years and ended with his death. He was finally buried in his famous step pyramid at Saqqara. Of the legendary 7 wonders of the ancient world, only the pyramids of Giza remain. Built more than 4,000 years ago, nearly 140 meters high, these pyramids contain some of the largest pieces of stone ever moved by humans. The Great Pyramid is made up of 2,300,000 blocks of stone, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons. However, this was accomplished without wheels or pulleys or even iron tools. The early pharaohs built more than 100 pyramids, 80 of which survive to this day. They accomplished this with highly sophisticated knowledge. The pyramids of Giza are built in perfect alignment with certain stars, which requires knowledge of astronomy. The foundations of the pyramids are set at perfect angles, and the dimensions are precisely correct for the height they were intended to reach. This requires knowledge of geometry and mathematics. Finally, they got these big stones to fit perfectly from the bottom to the top. That requires incredible engineering knowledge and perfect organization. To create the Great Pyramid of Cheops, it took more than 20 years, more than 2 million stone blocks, and about 20,000 people. But how were they built? How could the Egyptians achieve such works of architecture with the rudimentary tools they had at their disposal at the time? What secrets do they hide? Why are there so many similarities with mega constructions built in other parts of the world? Did they really have a funerary function? All this and many other mysteries surrounding these marvelous constructions we are going to explore in a video specifically dedicated to tell you everything that is known today about the pyramids. But now, let's continue exploring how the history of the ancient kingdom of Egypt unfolded until the collapse of this mighty empire around the year 2200 before our era. King Zoser was succeeded by his eldest son Shekhemki. Imhotep then served 3 other kings of the 3rd dynasty. He also served as Egypt's physician. Because of his architectural genius and knowledge of the gods, Imhotep was to be revered and was subsequently deified. Eventually, he was worshipped as the god of wisdom and medicine. The death of King Huni marked the end of the glory that was the 3rd dynasty. His successor would initiate a period that took Egypt to even greater heights. King Huni had only one daughter, named Hetepheres, who married one of the military leaders, Snofru. Snofru would thus become the founder of the 4th dynasty. Around the year 2600 before our era, King Snofru began the 4th dynasty. The Red Pyramid, built by Snofru, became the 4th largest in Egypt. Snofru's son, Cheops, would build the Great Pyramid of Giza, the largest ancient man-made monument still standing. After Cheops came the pharaoh Djedefre, and then Khafre. The latter built a pyramid next to that of his father, King Cheops. Khafre had the Sphinx of Giza, a being with the body of a lion and a human head, added to the adjacent temples of his pyramid. The pharaoh is credited with the construction of the 3rd pyramid of the Giza Plateau. According to the belief of the ancient Egyptians, the disappearance of the body carried with it the loss of the eternal life of the soul. The pharaoh was buried inside the pyramid. Since the body had to be kept incorruptible, it was mummified and surrounded with offerings to help it reach the afterlife. Ancient Egyptian society was divided into social classes with large estatesmen, landowners, merchants. This was followed by a large middle class. Then there were the workers, led by intendants. The family was the center of this society. Music was something fundamental, as well as sports. Trade was boosted by the construction of large ships. With them they reached Canaan and other areas of the Levant, from where they obtained wood and metals. They also reached the Red Sea, and there are researchers that believe they reached some of the Aegean islands such as Crete. And we arrive at the stage of the ancient kingdom of Egypt, in which the decadence of this first empire begins. Around the year 2500 before our era, Khentkawes, the daughter of Menkaure, married the high priest of Ra, Uzurkaz, who founded the 5th dynasty. His reign lasted 7 years and was characterized by construction. Through reforms carried out by Uzurkaz, the power of the pharaoh was weakened, as well as that of the central government. The latter was no longer a god, but a mere son of the god Ra. With this, the monarch became dependent on the priestly caste, which gained in power and influence. On the other hand, the nomarchs, who were the local governors, began to grow stronger and stronger and became a nuisance to the central government of the pharaoh. It was a time of high instability. Finally, the nomarchs ended up being sovereigns of the provinces they ruled. Thus, an increasingly important fragmentation was taking place in Egypt. Aggravating the situation of the kingdom, due to the reserves that were dedicated to the maintenance of the cults and to a boom in religious constructions, Egypt would be plunged into an economic crisis. But what would give the final blow to the ancient kingdom of Egypt was the famine, caused by a phase of intense aridity, which begins in the year 2200 and extends until the year 2100 before our era. This event, which is recorded all over the world, is what marks the end of the early Bronze Age in the history of our world. This final stage of the ancient kingdom of Egypt had Nitocris as its last pharaoh. Egypt then suffered a pronounced decrease in rainfall, as well as the interruption of the usual flooding of the Nile, and all this led to a period of famine. This event, in addition to affecting Egypt, wreaked havoc on the other civilizations of the time, which went into rapid decline. During the following period, a new set of cultures would emerge. What follows in the history of this civilization is an exciting stage in which Egypt expanded its territories and economic horizons during the Middle and New Kingdoms. Famous pharaohs ruled Egypt. Pharaohs like Thutmose, Amenophis, Akhenaten, Ramses, Hatshepsut, and many others, we will explore the resurgence of this fabulous civilization after the collapse of the ancient kingdom. After a period of high instability, Egypt managed to reunify, but then suffered the invasion of foreign peoples, who took control of the nation. For 500 years, Egypt would not again experience a golden age, such as it had experienced during the ancient kingdom. How did the time of the Middle Kingdom pass? How did Egypt fall under the control of foreign peoples? Who were the pharaohs who succeeded in regaining control of Egypt, and who laid the foundations for the new kingdom to emerge, the second golden age of this civilization? At the end of the ancient empire, centralized political control disintegrated, and local rulers came to the fore, ushering in an era we call the First Intermediate Period. The collapse was the result of famine, brought on by a period of extreme drought, which lasted 100 years, and would have caused not only the collapse of the ancient Egyptian empire, but also that of other empires, such as the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia. In a sense, the ancient Egyptian culture never seemed to fully recover from this cataclysm. According to surviving Middle Kingdom texts, there was a more pronounced fear of chaotic forces and an emphasis on unity within the country. At the same time, the memory of turmoil may have been inspiring to the ancient Egyptians, as it showed them that they could recover from periods of disorder. Perhaps this is at least part of the reason why the Middle Kingdom was seen in later times as an ideal era. The First Intermediate Period in Egyptian history is a time when no one person or family ruled all of Egypt, a period between two kingdoms. During the First Intermediate Period, two families fought for control of Egypt. By this time, political power had coalesced around two centers, Heracleopolis in the north and Thebes in the south. The southern rulers eventually defeated the Heracleopolitans. During this time, the Egyptian scribes narrate a time when there were 70 kings in 70 days. This may seem like an exaggeration, however, it speaks of a time of unrest and lack of continuous leadership. Mentuhotep II is considered the founder of the Middle Kingdom. This pharaoh was part of the 11th dynasty, which ruled Upper Egypt from the city of Thebes. Mentuhotep defeated the last of the rulers of the 10th dynasty, which ruled Lower Egypt and reunified the nation. He wore the double crown, representing the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. Thebes, a city of Upper Egypt, became the capital of the pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom was a time of achievement for the ancient Egyptians. Ancient art adopted diverse styles, including the block style, characterized by the hand sculpting of large stones by early artists. Irrigation projects at the Great Oasis of Fayum, located on the west bank of the Nile in Lower Egypt, increased harvests. The Egyptians used writing before the Middle Kingdom to keep records and honor the gods and goddesses. But during the Middle Kingdom, they also used it to tell stories. During this period, monumentality achieved a greater balance between architecture and sculpture. While great temples, pyramid complexes, and tomb superstructures were built, none of these buildings had the same massiveness as their counterparts in the Old or New Empire. The Middle Kingdom period was ruled by the 11th, 12th, and 13th dynasties. Historians sometimes also include the 14th dynasty. The Middle Kingdom reached its peak under the rule of the 12th dynasty. The pharaohs of the time built a powerful standing army, which protected the country from outside invaders and maintained control of the government. The greatest point of economic prosperity came during the reign of Pharaoh Amenemhat III, which lasted 45 years. During the 13th dynasty, the pharaoh's control of Egypt began to weaken. Eventually, a group of 14th dynasty kings from northern Egypt broke away from the south. As the country fell into disarray, the Middle Kingdom collapsed and the Second Intermediate Period began. The Second Intermediate Period was a time when, once again, Upper and Lower Egypt were divided. It is the darkest period of Egypt, as hardly any evidence has survived. 4 dynasties reigned in this period. The Egyptians always felt safe from foreign attacks, so their army was not equipped to repel invasions. They still used copper weapons, not bronze. Egyptian soldiers did not wear armor. But this reality of Egypt was about to change. Slowly, during the 12th and 13th dynasties, between the years 1991 and 1649 BC, in the area of the Eastern Nile Delta, a people of non-Egyptian characteristics that originated in the Near East began to settle. They were heterogeneous groups from the area of Canaan and the eastern lands near the Nile. These peoples, which included Aurites and Amorites, may have had a certain Semitic component. It is believed that they migrated towards Egypt, escaping from the famine in their lands. They were the Ixos, who thus progressively became strong in different cities of the country and gained power in important enclaves such as Memphis. Around 1675 to 1650 BCE, the Ixos rose to power and founded the 15th dynasty. They took control of the territory of Avaris, which became their capital, and of much of the Delta, and even conquered Memphis. Although culturally less advanced, they gradually gained positions of responsibility, and when they were sure of their superiority, they attacked. The Ixos adapted quite well to the Egyptian administrative system and structures, and maintained a large number of officials of Egyptian origin. In addition, they respected the writing system, the artistic models, and the costumes and traditions. But above all, they maintained the ritual and protocol of the pharaonic monarchy, linked to the devotion to the god Ra. They introduced many innovations in the art of war, and it is believed that it was from here, when they began to develop the chariots pulled by horses. The Ixos people spoke Semitic languages. During this time, the Hebrews, also Semitic, migrated to Lower Egypt and were welcomed by the Ixos, and they would reign for 100 years. For about 100 years, the Ixos ruled Lower Egypt, but they could not maintain control in Upper Egypt. In Upper Egypt, the rulers of the city of Thebes rebelled against the rule of the Ixos. Meanwhile, they studied and copied the superior weapons of the Ixos, captured and bred horses, and prepared for the day when they would regain Lower Egypt. Finally, Pharaoh Ahmose I drove the Ixos out of Egypt. The Ixos had a lasting effect on Egypt's culture and military progress. With Ahmose I, the new kingdom of Egypt was born in the year 1540, with a newly unified nation under the rule of a king. It would begin the period of maximum splendor of the civilization, the Second Golden Age of Egypt, a time when it also achieved a great territorial expansion. With the beginning of the period of the New Kingdom, what was to become the first empire of Egypt would take shape. Egypt was not an empire until the New Kingdom. That is why we speak of kingdoms when we refer to the Old and Middle Kingdoms, because until the New Empire, Egypt had not extended its dominions to other peoples. One of the first pharaohs of this period was Thutmose III. Thutmose III came to the throne of Egypt because his father, Pharaoh Thutmose II, and his great royal wife, Queen Hatshepsut, had no male descendants. Chance was generous with Egypt, because Thutmose had all the necessary qualities for the good ruler, and one more, his extraordinary military capacity, which added to a courage to all test, earned him the loyalty of the most powerful army of the Near East. Egypt had during his reign a great military power. The Egyptians had obtained from the Ixos great advances in the art of war, in addition to the development of chariots pulled by horses. These chariots would be part of most of the warlike confrontations in the last part of the Bronze Age. In 1457 before our era, the rulers of ancient retinue tried to free themselves from the yoke of Egyptian hegemony. They allied themselves with the kingdom of Mitanni and with that of Kadesh. This alliance was also joined by Megiddo. This Canaanite coalition was commanded by the king of Kadesh. Thutmose then gathers a large army of chariots and infantry, amounting to 10,000 men, to repel this revolt. They headed for Megiddo, a fortified city near Mount Carmel in present-day Israel. On the other side of these hills, the enemies of the pharaoh are waiting ready to meet them. The fate of the empire is at stake. The two greatest armies ever seen in the ancient world were preparing for combat. It would all end at the Battle of Megiddo, the first battle in history for which there is a detailed historical account, and it ends with an Egyptian victory, forcing the Canaanites to retreat to the city of Megiddo, where they were subsequently besieged and defeated. With the re-establishment of Egyptian rule in Canaan, Thutmose III began a reign in which the Egyptian empire reached its period of greatest expansion. Thebes thus became the capital of the most powerful empire in the world. By 1353, Egypt was the most powerful nation in the world. Pharaoh Akhenaten takes power, who together with his wife Nefertiti, decided to challenge the entire faith system of ancient Egypt, shaking the very foundations of the Egyptian worldview. His ideas brought the nation to the brink of the abyss. Akhenaten's idea was dramatic and revolutionary. Replace the pantheon of the 2,000 traditional Egyptian gods with just one, the creator of all, the sun. And he did. For the traditional priests, who had dedicated their entire lives to the ancient gods and had been extremely powerful until then, it was a catastrophe. Akhenaten began to acquire dangerous enemies. After suffering several family tragedies, Akhenaten was poisoned. By 1332, Egypt was in the midst of intense internal revolts. This is the time when Akhenaten's son, the 9-year-old Tutankhamun, came to power. Tutankhamun acceded to the throne at 9 years of age under the tutelage of the Vizier I, who would eventually be his successor. The kingdom was economically weak and was in crisis after Akhenaten's breakaway reign. Diplomatic relations with other kingdoms had been neglected, so Tutankhamun sought to restore them, particularly with Mitanni. It was Tutankhamun who rescued the ancient gods and restored Egypt's power and prosperity. He began to restore the ancient monuments damaged during the previous period. The priests returned more powerful than ever, and life returned to normal. No Egyptian pharaoh ever again tried to change the established order or defy the gods. In this second golden age of Egypt, the nation had the most powerful army in the entire Near East. The Hittites of Asia Minor were its greatest enemy. During this stage of the Bronze Age, wars were brutal. The pharaohs participated in the battles from chariots that were used like modern tanks. The Hittite infantry could not cope with the chariots and the Egyptian army. But in 1323 BC, Tutankhamun dies at the age of 19. No records are preserved of the circumstances of Tutankhamun's death, so this matter has generated considerable debate and important studies. Tutankhamun was buried in a tomb that was unusually small for a pharaoh in the Valley of the Kings. His death perhaps occurred unexpectedly before the completion of a larger royal tomb, forcing the burial of his mummy in a tomb intended for another person of lesser rank. His tomb would remain undiscovered for 3,000 years. By the year 1279 before our era, Egypt was still the most important nation in the known world. And in that year of the new empire, the peak period of ancient Egypt, the greatest and most powerful pharaoh would come to power. Ramses II. Ramses would take Egypt to new heights. His successors and later Egyptians called him Great Ancestor. He was the third pharaoh of the 19th dynasty of Egypt, who ruled about 66 years until 1213. He was the son of Pharaoh Seti I and his great royal wife Tuya. At the age of 15 years, Ramses already had authority over part of the army. During the first 5 years of his reign, Ramses II carried out 5 successful military actions. A naval battle in the Delta against the attack of Shardana pirates. Expeditions to Asia as a reaction to threats from the Hittites. Conquests in Libya, where he established several colonies and built several fortresses to guard them, and the greatest battle in history up to that time, the Battle of Kadesh. In Asia Minor, the Hittites were expanding their empire. The Hittite king was a great rival of the Egyptian pharaohs. In the 5th year of his reign, Ramses decided to cut off the Hittite attacks. A conflict in Egypt arose over the control of Kadesh. In 1274, Ramses led his army north to Kadesh. The Battle of Kadesh was the greatest battle of the Bronze Age. Involved 6,000 chariots. Ramses returned triumphant. But in reality, there was no winner in this war. The Hittites sent representatives to negotiate peace. A formal peace treaty was concluded between the parties. It is the first peace treaty in known history. To close the deal, the Hittite princess was given in marriage to Ramses. The latter part of the Bronze Age was a period in which diplomacy reigned. Kings sent emissaries to different places. War was no longer the only solution to conflicts. All kinds of treaties between kingdoms were concluded. Through diplomacy and cross-marriage unions, the territorial states of the Near East became more closely knit than ever. It was an era of great kings, but none more important than Ramses II. He was a great builder. Great buildings were erected during his reign. Much of the labor force was made up of Egyptian workers, but there were also Hebrew slaves from the Canaan region. It is believed that it was during the reign of Ramses that the story of Moses emerged. Ramses would reign for 67 years, command the greatest empire on earth, capture the imagination of the world, and build a reputation, which has resonated throughout history. By 1213 BC, when preparations were already underway to celebrate his 67th year in power, news broke that Ramses the Great had died. Each succeeding pharaoh would strive to recreate his greatness. Ramses had held the empire for more than half a century, and he had assumed that his legacy would last forever. But the Bronze Age civilizations were coming to an end. By 1200 before our era, the Eastern Mediterranean suffered a serious setback. All the major cities were affected. The great Bronze Age civilizations were collapsing. These, the greatest civilizations of the time, were wiped out. Tens of thousands died or were displaced. Everything collapsed. What happened at the end of the 13th century remains a mystery. It was the disaster that appears in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, in the books of Joshua and in the Old Testament. But what caused this epic destruction is still a mystery. What is believed so far is that the collapse was the product of various environmental phenomena, coupled with invasions by the peoples of the sea. The Near East was affected by droughts. Rivers dried up. Crops failed. A great volcano erupted in Egypt, affecting the climate of the region. And the peoples of the sea came from the north, and taking advantage of the weaknesses of the various civilizations at the time, attacked, plundered, and destroyed everything in their path. For 200 years, the great civilizations of the Bronze Age were destroyed or seriously impacted. Trade between cities ceased. No written records have been identified over a period of 200 years. Less than 200 years after the end of Ramses' reign, the empire had fallen. From then on, all the other empires of the ancient world tried to emulate Egypt. From the Assyrians to the Persians, from the Greeks to the Romans. Today, millions still pay tribute to the pharaohs. "3,000 years later, Egypt's golden empire continues to conquer the world's imagination.